last year I was having issues with my internet, and I was like, it was just completely gone one day. And I was like, what happened? And I was thinking, like, what happened that day to, potentially cause this? And I remember my husband had been doing yard work. And it turns out when he was cutting the grass, he had physically cut the cord from the cable box that connected to our house. And so, yeah, there was no saving ourselves from that. So that was one of our fun times of scrambling and going to the library to work from there for a day. So beware of cables outside when you're cutting your grass this spring.
Yep. You were the victim of a physical infrastructure attack.
Yes. Sabotage by my husband.
Well, welcome back to Season 3 of OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Before we dive into it, we should go around and introduce ourselves. There's 3 of us online at present, maybe more joining. Don't know. We'll see. But first up, we have Lance Lamont.
Hi. I've been involved in a reasonable number of these, so
hello
again. Yeah.
Hopefully Lance needs no introduction.
I'm mostly behind the scenes, although I do like talking. So work on the SecureOT platform, doing a lot of the front-end research on how to interact with various devices. And
also joining us is Natalie Kalinowski.
Hello, everyone. I'm a little bittersweet to say hello and goodbye because this will be the last OT After Hours that I'll be joining. So it's been a great time, Ken. Thanks for including me in this little adventure the last couple of years.
Your nickname is now Spoiler Alert. And yes. But yes. Yes. Natalie is unfortunately, fortunately for her, on to a great new opportunity. We won't mention names, but it's one of those things where you hate to see somebody go, but when you hear where they're going, you're like, yeah, I can't blame you. And yeah, so, I mean, Natalie, again, if you've been listening to the podcast, she has contributed to many, many episodes, and she's been a lot of our sort of behind the scenes planning. She's very, very good at like just quickly throwing together summary notes for discussion topics. I will attempt to replicate this for future episodes, although didn't for this one. But yeah, we bid farewell to Natalie, and we do wish her well in future endeavors. And like I say, we won't name names, but I mean, how long were you with Rockwell, Natalie?
I started with Rockwell back in 2022, so it's been like 4.5 years that I've been around here. So those of you who are more familiar with the Rockwell Automation kind of gambit, they have this really neat program called I think outside it's called EDGE, but internally we call it the Leadership Development Program. So my first 2 years at Rockwell, I spent bouncing around from different groups in cyber and networks, learning as much as I can from so many great mentors. And so that was kind of my start at Rockwell. And then right when, it was the big acquisition of Verve, or now SecureOT, I was in a really ideal position to join the team. And so then I kind of jumped on the train, and then I've been with the SecureOT team since the acquisition. And it's been a really great learning experience and probably the best people I've gotten to work with. So it's been awesome.
Well, I mean, if you want to hear a little bit more about Natalie's complete journey, she was the focus of one of our episodes last season, middle of season 2. We did sort of a bunch of career profiles, and she was one of them. So you can go and listen to her, a little bit of an expanded version of that story. But yeah, she's been an invaluable member of, especially like some of the, we call them, we have different names: proof of concept, proof of value, virtual proof of value. We have all these different acronyms floating around. But just putting the product out there in front of potential new clients. And Natalie, you were just crazy instrumental in making that a success, and in organizing all of that, and in making sure that all of those different efforts were humming along smoothly. And now we're going to have to figure out who's going to step into that role. And that is not going to be me, because I have stepped into too many other roles lately. But
the nice part is we do have a really great group of experienced individuals here at Rockwell. So it's not like it's a unfillable position.
No,
but
absolutely
we'll definitely be missing you, Natalie.
Yep. And I mean, we were feeling it this morning already. But yeah, do wish you all success in the new role, because I think you're going to be great at it. And yeah, I mean, who knows? Maybe we'll hear your voice on some other cybersecurity podcast someday.
That would be neat.
Yeah. So as we were kind of joking just before you joined, we didn't really have notes prepared, but and look at that. You just go ahead and throw something completely different than what I was going to say into the chat. Was that this? Yes.
For context, I did a little bit of searching for ideas for today's episode, and I just threw it in the chat out of nowhere since I'm now out of the system. So Ken and Lance just got thrown a bunch of cool information, and
so we did.
Cover.
Oh man. Well, I guess then maybe I'll shelf the one that I was going to suggest, and we'll go with one of these. And do you know, I like the last one here actually, because it's something that I think I see come up a fair bit. Actually reminds me of a post I saw on X where, someone, and I mean, it was intended in jest, but someone put up an image of just a little like Visio type network diagram with 7 firewalls chained together, and they were all different brands. And underneath there were like little notes. It's like, okay, well, you start with the Cisco firewall, but then to compensate for the fact that there are American backdoors in the Cisco firewall, then you put a Huawei firewall. But to compensate for the fact that there are Chinese backdoors in the Huawei firewall, you put a Fortinet firewall. It just kind of keeps going through all the vendors and all of the rumored ways that they've been backdoored. And then I think the last one was like one of those open source firewall solutions that you can install on a Raspberry Pi. So, but there is something to that because... And I think we have talked about this on the podcast before, but yeah, I mean.
So the topic we're kind of covering is just the idea that when you're in an OT environment, like obviously you're going to try and attempt a multi-layered approach. You're going to have a bunch of things going on either from the network side, from the patching side, and your actual equipment. But if you're just starting out or just this might be the first podcast you're listening to, getting that idea of the broader view of your environment is probably the first step you're going to want to take. And I think for me, like, I mentioned that I rotated through a bunch of groups. One of the very first rotation I did was a network engineer, where I basically just went around and assessed networks, like configured VLANs, configured switches. And it's such a little fundamental piece of your environment that, when you're thinking about all the, SCADA systems, HMIs, PLCs, the thing that at its core is connecting all these systems is the network they're talking across. Kind of like if you hear us talk about the SecureOT platform, you'll hear us talking about native protocols. Like what are these devices communicating across? Are they using Ethernet IP, DeviceNet, ControlNet, SNMP, HTTPS? There's so many different ways to communicate across the network. And so kind of the first step for you to get familiar with your environment is kind of being aware of, what are my devices and how are they communicating? Those two pieces are, it sounds similar, but it's simple, but they're like huge. I don't know. There's so much information you can gather just from those two pieces, is knowing, what is the device I'm looking at and how are we communicating to it? Because like Ken was saying, is each device, if you're looking at a firewall or a switch, they all have their own, vulnerabilities. And so when you're layering those different types of devices, you have to kind of be aware of, okay, what's the risk with this device and what is the risk with this device and how can they kind of complement each other? And so that's that kind of layered defense strategy you'll hear people talk about in an OT environment is, how do you layer your different, security for your endpoints or for your network and the applications you're using. So that's probably one of the things I would recommend. If you're not super familiar with networks, I recommend checking out the CCNA kind of guidebooks and, learning materials online, because that's probably the kind of the bedrock of learning how networks work in this world, or even not just OT, but also IT. So that was just kind of the intro I'll kind of throw in there, and I'll let Ken and Lance kind of maybe talk about their experiences with, how do you start with this?
Just to illustrate a little bit further, because one of the other things that I've seen a lot, more than I care to, is when we talk about layering networks. I mean, you're absolutely right that, obviously, you have your OT environment and your devices are communicating on some kind of network. But we also have to introduce, and maybe for those who are completely unfamiliar with it, we have to introduce the concept of network layers. And I say for those who are unfamiliar because I've been in facilities before where the network has been essentially flat. It's just one network throughout the entire facility. So you have, your production computers, your operators' computers, your PLCs, your controllers, all sitting on the same network as the front office staff's computers. And I mean, there are and that's where a lot of sort of the scarier stories in OT cybersecurity come out of, is when you have these flat networks, just a single network throughout your entire facility, obviously parts of it are internet facing. And usually when parts of it are internet facing, all of it's internet facing. And that's really, really bad when then you have controllers or PLCs or cameras or safety systems or just really, really old technology. I've seen NT4 boxes sitting live on the internet as recently as like 2016. Scary. So when we talk about this sort of layered defense, one of the first things that we're trying to communicate there is figuring out what the purpose of the devices, like figuring out what the purpose of your network is first, because obviously, like if you have in any facility, there's going to be there's going to be the front office, and those people are going to need to create Word documents and send emails and do all of the normal office things, many of which are internet facing these days. And so they will need a network, and that should be a completely different network than anything involved with running the facility's operations occupies. That should be a totally different network with totally different networking hardware. And if there does need to be some kind of interconnect because there needs to be data flow from the process side of the facility to the front of house, from the OT to the IT, then there should be firewalls, and ideally more than one. Getting back to the idea of chaining firewalls together. There's you don't need to put 7 in a row. I mean, there was a joke obviously being made there, but it is not unusual to see 2 firewalls facing each other with a little stub network between them from different vendors, because one of the strengths in that configuration is if I can get through one firewall, great. Now I have a completely different firewall by a completely different vendor that I'm trying to get past. The vulnerability that I just used is not going to help me here. So now I'm back to the drawing board. But also just that act of separating out, okay, this is the stuff that needs to face the internet. And then all this stuff over here is what runs my plant, and hopefully none of it needs to touch the internet. And if it does, I have to be very, very mindful, very, very careful about how I allow it to do that and which components are allowed to do that.
Yes. One of the things that I found really interesting when I joined this team, when I started being involved in security, is I'd never even heard of the term data diode before. And when we talk about network and the connection between IT and OT, that actually ends up being a very, very powerful tool as well. Not just a firewall which can manage the data, but still allows data to go in both ways. A data diode can be very, very powerful to help keep that network secure, because that Windows NT box might be there for a reason, and it might be the only thing that can run the software that's running the ancient whatever robot arm that's critical for that process. So, yeah, that was one of the things that I discovered when I joined the security world.
Yeah, and we have talked about a lot of that before. I mean, if you've been following the podcast since we started, none of this will really come across as particularly new. And if you're new to the podcast, well, first, hello. And secondly, this will keep you up at night. But anyways, I mean, it is true. You see this, and you see this in not just like what we think of as maybe I'll say traditional OT, gas plants, power plants, pulp mills, and all of that stuff. You see it sometimes with like medical. You see it sometimes in banking. There are legacy systems out there, and they're connected to mission critical things. And to replace them would not be a case of just, running to Staples and buying the new version of the thing, because there is no new version of the thing, and the vendor went out of business a long time ago. It's just the thing. There is nothing else to replace the thing unless you rip the whole thing out and put a completely new thing in. And at that point, you're in a capital project. And not everybody does those every 3 years. So you do find a lot of this legacy gear just kicking around in OT environments. And it's there, and the thing it's connected to keeps the business humming, keeps generating revenue, and there's no reason to change it because you've got spare parts to last you all decade that you've ordered off of eBay. And again, replacing it is not just a simple matter of, upgrading to the next version. It's, we got to pull this whole thing out and put a completely new one in. And those are two very different considerations. So what do? Well, you keep it running because you need to keep it running. But protecting it, well, Microsoft's not shipping updates for NT4 anymore. Even for like really, really critical stuff. They might go as far back as 7 if it was something like super critical, like an SMB vulnerability. But they're definitely not going to go back as far as NT. So you got to do something else. And that should at least start with not having it sitting on the same network as where everybody's checking their emails.
For sure. And we've been talking about, legacy devices and starting with, something. I think it all really started with the convergence of, IT and OT networks, all that connectivity happening. And it made me think of, are you two familiar with CPWE? It's one of Rockwell's kind of reference architectures that is free to everybody. So if you're listening to this, you can look it up. For context, CPWE stands for Converged Plant-Wide Ethernet. It's basically a reference architecture that Rockwell Automation and Cisco systems kind of work together to create, and it's essentially a validated design system for like building an industrial network. And so what that means is, even if you're running all of your devices that have been running for decades, or maybe not decades, but at least a decade or so, this is like one of those blueprints that you can use to start securing your environment, because it's validated for like a plant floor environment. Because the problems you were seeing with that convergence of IT and OT was that suddenly people weren't expecting to have PLCs that are connected to somehow the internet, or SCADA systems that were connected to business networks, or remote access becoming super common everywhere. And so that kind of chaos is what kind of instigated this reference architecture being built. And so then when CPWE came around, which again, you can Google it, you can download it, you can look at information on it to learn about it. Basically what it is it's like a repeatable architecture that has like very clear segmentation models. And one of the first things it does is, other than creating these zones and conduits, it follows a similar kind of model to what like IEC 62443 recommends, where your networks are divided into zones and then communication flows through like conduits. But probably one of the most important concepts is the idea of like an industrial DMZ or IDMZ, depending on who you're talking to. And essentially what it is, it's like a little buffer zone between IT and OT. So instead of IT directly talking to your PLCs, it talks to the systems in the DMZ, like your historians, your patch servers, those remote access gateways. And so that separation is what is critical, because it allows you to have essentially that buffer zone between your IT and your OT, so that your PLCs, you're not going to be able to someone's not going to be able to go through the internet to talk to a PLC and then do God knows what to your environment. So that's one of the first things that I thought of as we've been talking about devices and networks, like what is out there that you can use today. And so CPWE is that thing that is, available to everyone.
Let's pause just to simplify a few concepts here, or at least to break them down into slightly more layperson terminology, because all of this is great, but equally, it can very easily become
overwhelming.
Inside baseball, technical jargon, and which, all of these terms have meaning, but only if only if you're kind of already inside the inside the community that understands those. Yeah.
The phone calls coming from inside the house?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, at the end of the day, and CPWE is a great framework. It absolutely is. Some listeners may have heard the Purdue model. That's an older framework. We're trying to move away from, using it as a strong reference point, but it's still out there. You still find it in conversations. Natalie's exactly right. The idea is that basically you're taking what you have and you're separating it out into distinct networks based on what it does and how critical it is to your process and how close it is to your process. Now, obviously, the beginning of that exercise is understanding what you even have in the first place. If you're, if the environment has been, shall we say, not the most well documented, starting there is that you have to start there. And obviously, the SecureOT software platform is one of the solutions that exists for figuring out what is actually out there in an environment. But that is where it starts. And once that part's done, then you have to have that sit down and actually look through what you have. Once you know what you have to sit down and look through it and figure out, okay, how are we supposed to divide this up? How should we divide this up? There's different ways you can do that. Generally speaking, looking at the relative risk ranking is not a bad way to do it. Looking at proximity to the process is not a bad way to do it. And what I mean by proximity to process is, if you think about, like, you have a boiler and you have some controllers and sensors hooked up to the boiler. Well, those are right on the boiler. So they are as close to the process as you can get, essentially. They're the last. I mean, there is a point where you have a device that has an Ethernet cable on one side and analog electrical signaling on the other side. That's as close to the process as you can get. And, that could be a PLC, that could be a controller, that could be some kind of sensor. Above that, maybe there are communications gateways, or maybe you're just going right into a network and then the operator's terminals are there getting all of this data from all of this stuff out there. And they're able to issue commands to valves and to controllers and what have you. So they're a little bit further away from the process, but they're able to interact with it in a way that affects it and can affect it very quickly. So they're still pretty darn close. And then above that, there might be domain controllers, there might be historians, there might be other control system related servers and databases and what have you, that, again, they're not, they're a little further removed from the process, again, still fairly critical to it. And then maybe as you start to get towards the front office, the IT space, now we're dealing with, okay, well, there's like a Pi server that's feeding things up for the production accountants and what have you. Now we're getting further away from the process. And if all of those things exist on the same subnet, not a great thing. Ideally, the controllers, the things that are closest to the process, especially, those kind of should be in their own walled-off safe space with only communications coming in and out that are absolutely necessary. And then maybe the operations level, that's a completely different level. And again, tightly controlled communications coming in and out. Can maybe go a level above that, where things like domain controllers and historians will live. And usually the IDMZ is going to get slotted in somewhere above that. And that is where things like the data diodes can reside. That's where things like, actually even some of our, like some of the SecureOT software sometimes resides there. Because it's basically it is the hardish boundary between what is IT and what is OT. And communications coming across it are tightly controlled, but they're also structured in such a way that everything that's flowing through that IDMZ is basically like something is taking some information and then handing it off to something else. You don't, the IDMZ exists as much to allow communications as to broker the communications. So you're never having a situation where someone on the IT side is talking all the way down to the controller, or even as far as like the process historian. But if someone on the IT space needs information from the process historian, well, the process historian hands data off to something that lives in that DMZ area, which then hands it off to the production accountant. And it's building out that structure, that layered approach that increases the amount of network hops you have to make before you get to things that are as close to the process as possible. That's what we're talking about, a layered defense strategy. That tends to be what we mean.
Yeah. And you also mentioned earlier on the beginning, like the Purdue model, how it's like kind of similar to CPWE, but it's more like conceptual, I think. So everything that you kind of mentioned, if someone wants to see like an image of something that kind of walks you through it in a little bit of a more clear way, if you just Google Purdue model, it'll kind of walk you through like that level 0 of like physical processes, like you were saying, like those sensors, actuators, valves, and then you would go to level 1 where you have your PLCs and those, basic control systems. And then as you go up another level, you'll get to those HMIs, those supervisory control type devices, and then eventually you get to, like you said, those historians, the enterprise, and so on. So that's another kind of, model you can look at if you wanted to kind of visualize everything we've been talking about so far.
Yeah, and there's other factors too, like criticality, right? Like safety systems, right? Should safety systems even be available, reachable on the network? I mean, some have to be programmed over a network, but do they need to be reachable in the same way that, say, the operator workstations are, or the actual controllers on the boiler process are. Should they be their own separate subnet that is completely islanded? There's arguments to be made either way. Some of these are philosophical debates as much as they are technological debates. But, there are all these other little considerations that come into play. And then, of course, there's the issue of, well, okay, what do I do with things like patching and updating? What do I do with things that I can't patch and update anymore, whether because they're just so outdated or because it would be too arduous of an exercise to regularly patch and update them? Again, that is where in the design of, your network, you should be taking those sort of considerations into account too. And yeah, maybe there are things you can't patch, either because they're just too old or, the vendor's just gone, or it's too convoluted. Yeah, there's no patches available, or it's too convoluted because you're now reliant on downtime, which you don't necessarily have a lot of, to put patches in place. There could be any number of reasons why you don't pull the trigger on patching. And in those cases, what can you do instead? And again, it comes down to, well, how are you shaping the network around these devices, which, unpatched, they are going to be, on average, more vulnerable than anything that you can patch. So what do you do about that? Can you do something else in terms of how you structure your network to put additional barriers between those more vulnerable devices and the internet or anybody who would attack them, or even just other systems where you may have some sort of inadvertent compromise or risk coming in?
Yeah, I echo everything you're saying. I'm trying to think of anything interesting I can add to it. But I think the most curious thing is, I spend a lot of time sometimes looking at the National Vulnerability Database, where you're looking at, CVEs and KEVs, the known exploits. And
yep.
For a lot of the not even just recent ones, but even ones that have been around for longer, there's not always a patch available or a solution. So kind of going back to the foundation of this is sometimes it's not even, protecting the individual device. It's just having a good network to be able to protect those devices around it, or just having the awareness, just knowing that, hey, this group of devices or this group of assets might have, these kind of vulnerabilities. And so if they do, what kind of, multi-layered approach can we do to kind of fix that gap we have? Because for now, the vendor hasn't come up with a solution. And so we need to do something to kind of stop that risk or stop that opening in our environment.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And there are other passive techniques that you can leverage too, or semi-passive techniques, right? Think about something like configurations, right? We can, and I mean, we are not the only tool that can do this, but we definitely can capture device configurations, at least from some of the devices that we're able to inventory. We don't ever change those configurations. And, I know there's a lot of discussions that have come up around this just in general in OT facing software. It's okay, well, it's great that you guys can inventory my devices, but can you update the firmware for me if the vendor releases a new one? And we've generally said, no, we're not doing that. And again, for good reason, because updating device firmware, if you can do it, it's great, but there are downtime risks associated with that. You don't want to brick these devices. There's lots of complexities that arise from that. And so we've generally not gone that route. But we can look at the configuration for, say, a Cisco switch. And if you are able to store the configuration for a Cisco switch and then periodically update your copy of the stored configuration for that switch, well, then if there's ever a delta, now you can fire off an alert.
Absolutely.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was going to say next. Change detection. That is something that is really handy to have, because then if you have that original running config file for one of your networking devices, I mean, you might not be thinking oh, I need to go check on that device every week to see if something changed. So this way you have this automated way of telling you that, if you're not getting an alert, it means it's still running the same way as expected. And so change detection is a really neat feature. So always make sure you're looking out for it when you're looking for tools, because that way you don't have to consciously be thinking about, okay, do I need to go check in on this device instead? Especially what properties change detection works on. So running config files, those are handy ones to have.
Yeah. And just, again, any particulars of the device, right? I mean, even something again, we don't update device firmwares, but we can tell you what firmware version a lot of devices in your environment are running. And if that changes, good, let's flag that, right?
Yep.
Because, I mean, generally speaking, firmware updates are probably being handled, I hope they're being handled in a responsible way within your organization. But I mean, if there was ever, just an unauthorized, hey, why is that firmware value totally different all of a sudden? And nobody knows why. Okay, now we got to figure out what's happening there. And
yeah, and I'll even pitch the tool. So one of the other features it can do, other than or the tool I'm talking about is SecureOT, because that's what we use at Rockwell. But
yep.
So not only can it tell, so it can tell you what firmware a device is running, and then obviously change detection can tell you when that firmware changes. But we can also compare it to what the vendor released firmware is. So you can essentially compare and see, like, what do you have versus what is the most recent, like, vendor released firmware. So you can see, I mean, being behind on firmware isn't necessarily the worst thing in the world, but then at least you have that awareness. So yep. That's another thing you can kind of look into.
So, yeah. Just to be clear, that is for many manufacturers, but not all of them. Some manufacturers don't necessarily publicize that information, or we can't necessarily pull all of that into the platform all the time.
Yeah, I know we're kind of growing that capability, and I know that it's dependent on our ability to scrape that information from vendors as we can get it. And yeah, it's not complete, but for where we have it, it's good to know. It is very helpful to know.
I did want to go back. We were talking about the devices and vulnerabilities. My team interacts with many of these devices from a standpoint of trying to interoperate with them. My team does the behind-the-scenes research to interact with these devices. And it has been a surprise to me the number of devices that have undocumented communications issues. So when we talk about this, when we're talking about this in the context of making sure we have a good segmented network and talking about patching and understanding what vulnerabilities are known on devices, we have found devices where literally if we just send one value different, not authenticated, nothing else, just one single packet, we've been able to knock devices off the network without even having that as our intent. So don't just look and say, well, we don't have any known vulnerabilities. NIST says we're safe. That's not the right perspective to take when we're talking about layering our networks and getting firewalls and so on. These devices, the incentive for these devices is not necessarily security. It's to make a product that could operate X
make
device. Yes, make it work first. And quite often it's pretty obvious they test the success path and they don't test failure paths.
Mm-hmm. It is true. Just kind of to bring this in, especially in OT, patching alone is not enough. If you can patch, absolutely do. But a lot of times you can't, or you can't apply every patch. And we've talked about a lot of that on previous episodes of the podcast, right? Vendors have to qualify patches before they can be released into the control system environment. And even when they do, some of those patches might require restarts. You can't always have those restarts because you need to maintain process visibility or you need to maintain process uptime. So then you're waiting for outages. And sometimes your outage window just isn't wide enough for you to apply everything that you need to do. So patching is already fraught. So it's definitely not enough to save your butt when it comes right down to it. And there are these other, the fancy term is compensating controls, but there's just other things you can do when you can't patch or when patching has to be deferred. Layered security. If you can build redundancy into your system, a lot of control systems already build that in, but having redundancy is another good thing to do. Doing your change detection, doing your change management, making sure that you're separating your networks out as much as you can. It all begins with knowing what you have, but then once you know what you have, then it's, figuring out how do we put all this other stuff in place. And within the budget that you have, obviously, another thing that we've been sensitive to in other episodes. Whether that, and again, different technologies to layer here. Perimeter controls, so it's your firewalls, your boundaries, your data diodes, remote access restrictions, network monitoring, change detection. If you can do endpoint hardening, great. If you can do USB device interdiction, great. If you can do application allow listing, great. Although now we're getting fancy, and that's not always an option. Physical controls, restricted access, locked doors. And then obviously training, making sure that everybody understands what you're doing, why you're doing it, because the last thing you want is for the night shift lead operator to unplug one of your network switches so that he can hook his wireless router in so that he can play Candy Crush while he's doing his floor inspections. Not even making that up. So anyways, all of those things work together to build security for an OT environment that is a much more challenging task to maintain than a lot of other networking environments out there. And I mean, I like this phrase that Copilot, I'm assuming you used there, Natalie, threw into the summary here. Resilience beats perfection. I like that. That's almost a motto. Resilience beats perfection.
Yep, absolutely.
All righty. Well, thank you for one last excellent topic, Natalie. And I mean, thank you for all your contributions to the podcast and to SecureOT. You've been invaluable. We will feel your absence for a while. We will miss your voice on the podcast, but Thank you.
Of course. Well, thank you for having me. It's been great being part of the team and part of the podcast, and I'm not going too far, so I'm sure we'll all cross paths eventually again. So thanks everyone for listening in, and hopefully you'll hear from me soon again. But thanks.
You've been listening to OT After Hours, a podcast about industrial cybersecurity, why it matters, and all of the challenges that it presents. Please do share our episodes with your friends, your family, colleagues, and anyone else you think would be interested in industrial cybersecurity. And please consider leaving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast has been produced by me, Kenneth Kully. Our opening and closing music is by the ever-so-talented Octo Sound. Thank you, Lance. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you out there for listening. We will talk to you soon.